Okay, so before I go into the story of these books, I'll give a bit of context as to why I've chosen them, because they're all linked. So when I was 17, I took part in this thing called the Spirit of Enniskillen scheme, which was set up by Senator Gordon Wilson, whose daughter was killed in Enniskillen in the bombing there. And we went on a trip to Latvia to explore the idea of conflict. And when I was there, I visited a concentration camp called Salis Pils, which is not a very well-known concentration camp. I was only 17 at the time, and it was one of the smaller camps, and I think about 2,000 people were killed there, but it made a huge impression on me, and I always had this interest in the Holocaust and what it means and in that type of oppression. So I suppose later on I visited Auschwitz, Birkenau, went to Yad Vashem, and I think it's something which is a very important part of European history. So that idea of totalitarianism, authoritarianism, and the impact it has on the individual is something which I found hugely interesting, I suppose, but also something which is hugely significant from the moral perspective, both collectively and personally. So the three books that I've chosen are connected to that idea. When I was studying philosophy fairly recently, I was reading Elizabeth Anscombe's work, and her essay, Modern Moral Philosophy, made a massive impact on me, because what she was talking about was the idea that very often when we do things, we don't necessarily know the moral nature of it. So what she was arguing was that the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, people were saying, well, it brought an end to the war, so it's a good thing. But she was saying the real nature of what was happening there was mass murder. And so I was sort of thinking about a lot of these kind of ideas after my studies in philosophy. So these three books made an impact on me, and I read them subsequently. So the first one is by a German Jewish philosopher, Hannah Arendt, who fled Germany at the time of the Nazi rule. And she ended up in America, and she wrote this book. This is her first book, The Origins of Totalitarianism. She's probably more famous for her book Eichmann in Jerusalem, where she coined this phrase, the banality of evil, where she describes someone who's so spectacularly evil, but yet so ordinary, so mundane. So she has this whole, I suppose, excursus on what that means. But in this book, she looks at the rise of totalitarianism in Europe. So she's focusing, I suppose, more on the Nazi regime, but also on Stalinism. And what I find fascinating in this is that she says that this was a new form of authoritarianism. It wasn't similar to what had gone before in, let's say, the ages of absolute monarchies or dictatorships. She said this was something completely different because it was the suppression of mass populations. It was quite different to what had gone before. And she said as well that the advances in technology and I suppose in logistics, that sort of thing, made this type of totalitarianism possible. And I suppose what really impacted upon me is how we apply that to the world that we live in today, with so much more in the way of technological advancements, that if a totalitarian situation were to arise in the world today, then how would we respond to that? And I've spent a lot of my life living in countries which are not democracies, which are, I don't think you could probably say they're not totalitarian, but they're authoritarian. And I've seen the effects of that type of thing on the lives of ordinary people. And I think that it's something which we need to think about as to whether it can arise again. One of the interesting points that Arendt makes in this book is that there was nothing inevitable about the Second World War, about the Holocaust, but the various factors that she identifies were there, and I think some of those factors are still there today. So she said that we see various phenomena, rootlessness to an unprecedented degree, social dislocation, the sort of thing we see in our world today, which she says wasn't inevitable, that it ended up in totalitarianism, but nevertheless with certain factors present, it can do. So I think the book serves for me, and the impact it had on me is that it's a real warning to be conscious of these movements and to think about those things, and also think about the moral implications of them. So the second book, building on what I've just said about Hannah Arendt's Origins of Totalitarianism, it's a book by Philip Roth, who's an American writer, called The Plot Against America, and it's alternative history, and it's set in 1940 to 1942. So in this alternative history, a fairly extremist president wins the vote in America. He makes peace with Hitler, and a campaign of persecution breaks out against a Jewish population in America. What's very interesting about the book is it really personalizes, I suppose, the abstract element of something that Hannah Arendt was talking about in the Origins of Totalitarianism. Is it you have a certain sympathy with the characters, you see them living a very ordinary life, they're secular Jews, they're interested in very boring, ordinary things like their holidays, the fights at school, very human life. They're not particularly religious, and yet their life completely changes as a result of this complete shift in the society that they're living in, and former neighbours are now enemies. So it's not an entirely apocalyptic vision, but nevertheless it is one which is it's quite sobering and quite sad in a certain sense, but at the same time it's very human. So I really enjoyed this because I thought it kind of brought to life the type of thing that could happen. So the third book, again, a related theme, and it's Dietrich Bonhoeffer's The Cost of Discipleship. So Bonhoeffer was a Lutheran pastor in Germany during the Second World War who opposed Hitler and ended up dying for that. And I suppose I've always been fascinated by all of these figures who really had that personal integrity and that courage to stand up to oppression and to do the right thing. So in our Catholic tradition we have Maximilian Kolbe, for example, and there are others, Sophie Scholl. I watched about a year ago A Hidden Life, film directed by Terence Malick, talking about Blessed Franz Jägerstätter, another example of a man who died for his convictions. And I think morally that's just an incredibly interesting and admirable thing. So Bonhoeffer wrote this book called The Cost of Discipleship, which really impacted upon me. So obviously he's writing from a Lutheran perspective, so it's not exactly the same as a Catholic viewpoint, but nevertheless I think a number of the ideas that he has in there is very important. And just one thing which I think probably sums it up, he talks about this idea of cheap grace. And he calls cheap grace as the preaching of forgiveness without requiring repentance, baptism without church discipline, and he goes on to say that it's grace without discipleship, grace without the cross, grace without Jesus Christ. And I think that idea that we can fall into today, that discipleship is personal devotion, which it is, or that it's personal asceticism, which again it is, but very often discipleship is something which might involve us in a more public sense, or making decisions that are more public, to stand up for something which is right in the face of great opposition, including from perhaps fellow Christians. Bonhoeffer certainly wasn't supported by all members of the Lutheran Church. So I think what the message of this is that discipleship very often can be something which is costly, and that doesn't mean to say that Christianity is a bed of nails or that it's a miserable way to live, but that doing the right thing and acting with integrity and responding to the grace of God is something which can be profoundly challenging, unsettling, and extremely difficult. And in Bonhoeffer's case, it led to his death. But I think that examples of men like him are fascinating. So this book talks about, it's talking about the wider context. But the other area that this book, I suppose I find it personally quite interesting, is that it has an impact beyond, I've been speaking about the wider political type of issues that we see, but in terms of your own life and how you respond with integrity. I spent a lot of my career working in corporate finance, and many of the type of ethical issues that Bonhoeffer writes about, they can arise in the world of business, serious ethical issues where you're required to take a stand where it's not comfortable, not easy. And many people find themselves in those types of situations today, who are maybe not going to be famous, or it's maybe not the biggest issue of the day. They're perhaps smaller issues. So I think this book addresses the challenges of that, but I think it's also an encouragement that grace can be costly, and I think that's a good message for today.